What's up, guys? It's Ethan here, and welcome to episode 1 of Read and React. And what we are going to do in this episode is I'm going to review 3 pieces of information on how well they talk about the same topic, and I'll be making some connections between these pieces of literacy. Now, what I mean by connections is that there are 3 connections I will be using today. There is the text itself connection, which is pretty much me relating this piece of text to some type of experience I have experienced in the past. Now, the second kind of text connection is text-to-text connection. Now, as the name implies, I'll be basically comparing 2 pieces of literacy we have here, and the third type of connection we have is text to world connection, and that is when you relate the text, or sorry, I should say connect the text, to something outside the classroom into the real world. Okay? Now, I'll be talking about the 3 pieces of information we have here. Now, we have our first book is Read, Write, and Inquire by Spires. The second book we have here is Literacy in the Disciplinaries by Bosley. And actually, the third piece of information we have is not even a piece of book. It's actually an audio from a podcast. Now, before I go in depth, let me discuss what's the general topic these 3 pieces of information are talking about. And what the general topic is disciplinary literacies. More specifically, what is disciplinary literacies and how and why is it important to a teacher or educator? Okay? So, first off, we're going to talk about chapter 1 of the book by Spires. Now, what I like about this book is that, yes, it does explain what disciplinary literacies are, but it also explains how it can be implemented on an educational level and why is it important to a teacher. For example, if you ever have the book and go to page 15, there's actually a page dedicated to where it talks about the standards how disciplinary literacies can be related to. And if you're not really familiar with what I'm talking about, is that every school has standards, and every teacher has to find ways to connect their teaching practices and strategies to these standards. And speaking of connections, the connection I'll be using for this text by Spires is text itself. And the reason is because during my time being new as doing some internship at teaching at a middle school, I had to make a lot of lesson plans. And for those of you who don't know what a lesson plan is basically you make a planner discussing what you're gonna how and what you're gonna do to teach a group of students. And in my lesson plan, I had to relate standards of how my teaching practices are related to the standards that the school wants me to try to accomplish. And having something like a chart in the Spires book that talks about different standards and how disciplinary literacy can impact those standards is a godsend. And it can be very helpful to someone like me who's still in the process of learning how to make good lesson plans. Now, moving on to the second piece of literacy is the book by Bosley. It's more specifically chapter 1. Now, similar to the Spires book, it does talk about what disciplinary literacies are, but what this does more specifically is actually kind of really focus us on introducing the concepts of disciplinary literacy and more like the terminology of you getting familiar with it. But one thing I do like of this book is that they actually give you a chart that kind of serves as like a note guide as you read throughout the book, which is pretty cool because this book has like a dedicated portion of the first chapter of how to read this book and how to take notes pretty much using this chart and you actually practicing the concepts and ideas they introduce to you. Now, in terms of connection, let's use text to text with this book. And the second, we're going to use the one previously with Spires. Now, as Spires focus more on the history about disciplinary literacies, it does do a lot more in how to implement and applications of disciplinary literacies in education, such as the standards of how that can correlate to disciplinary literacy I was mentioned. Now, with Bosley, even though it also explains what disciplinary literacies are, it does a really good job really breaking down the basic concepts and terminology that you need to know for disciplinary literacies, and also gives you a guide how to understand the book moving forward, which is pretty cool. Now, moving on to our third piece of information, which I even said is not even a book, was actually an audio podcast called Classroom Caffeine, and it involves a person named someone who names Kirchhoff, who's an expert in this kind of field. And in this podcast, so it was kind of uniquely formatted, is that there's actually two people that you listen to in this podcast. A person asking questions and a person answering these questions who is an expert in disability literacies, and Kirchhoff is that expert. And to basically kind of go over what it happens in this podcast, it does explain what disability literacies are, but you also get a first-hand experience of an expert using disability literacies in the education field for years. She gives and she does a good job at reviewing why disciplinary literacies are important in the education field, and she even goes even further breaking down what disciplinary literacies are. More specifically, is disciplinary literacy is basically the idea of how one piece of tool may be used in different fields of work, but the skills and reasons why people use that tool is completely different. For example, one thing that we'll be doing a lot in this class, or as students in general, is reading and writing. Now, let's talk about reading more specifically. And if you're reading a story, or if you're in an English class and we're talking about reading slash writing, you're looking for characters, climax, antagonists, stories, narratives, right? When it comes to reading. But if you're in a science field, a science setting, you're gonna be looking at charts and data, and you're not gonna use the mindset you have of English, where you're looking for stories, climax, and whatnot. You can be just looking at numbers, calculations, and data. Completely different ballpark. And this podcast does a great job explaining to you that even though a tool is used in different fields, the reasons why those experts use that tool and how it is used is completely different. And this podcast explains that if you teach these students and make them understand that this is what disciplinary literacy is, you have a better chance making those students experts in it, because now you're changing their mindset to how to be efficient and really good at using this tool that's used across in all of our classes in this one class. Now, let's go to the review. Now, the topic that, as a reminder, is kind of like introducing display literacy and how it can be impactful as a teacher that I'm trying to become. Now, let's go start off with Spires. Spires does a good job at giving like a good history of how where disciplinary literacy came from regarding the amount of research cases it talks about, and it does a good job at showing some very practical applications that will be used when trying to utilize this as a teacher. Like as briefly mentioned, the teaching standards that are discussed about. Now, the second book by Wasley, I think is the good. It's like kind of the best one if you have no idea what disciplinary literacy is because they really on the first chapter they really focus on explaining what the terms and concepts are, and it gives you a dedicated explanation of how to read and understand this book, and even a chart that you can use for notes for future chapters. So I would recommend this book just if you want to get your feet wet in this of disciplinary literacy. Then I would recommend the Spires book if you're a teacher trying to look some like intro ways of how disciplinary literacy can be used as a teacher. Now, now my recommendation on the third one, the podcast, is yeah, even though the podcast does explain briefly about disciplinary literacy, it can be quite confusing if you're not very familiar with the content, the concept itself. So I would recommend trying to pick up one of these books. I'll probably recommend Wasley. And if you're interested in being it more broken down by an expert, listen to the podcast. And another reason why I think the podcast is also a good one to look at after understanding the concepts is that the expert breaks down and like explains the importance of disciplinary literacy. Because I feel like a lot of times as students or people just learning a new skill in general, when they look at methods and strategies in books and like texts, they kind of skeptical if these actually work practically. So listening to that podcast can give you reassurance that all of her all the concepts and ideas that are discussed in these two books do work, and she does explain why they're effective and important. So yeah, that was Read and React episode one. This is your guy Ethan, and I hope you guys have a good night. I hope to see you soon in the next episode. Bye.